The gunshot split the air like thunder, and every soul in Red River, New Mexico, fell silent as the tin can sailed backward off the fence post, spinning wildly before clattering to the dusty ground. It was August 1878, and the scorching afternoon sun beat down mercilessly on Main Street, where a crowd had gathered for what started as friendly target practice, but had transformed into something far more intriguing. Harrison Dalton lowered her rifle slowly, aware of every eye fixed upon her, particularly the startled green eyes of Blake Whitmore, the cocky cowboy who had just challenged her shooting skills. She had not intended to show him up quite so spectacularly, but when he made that comment about women belonging in kitchens rather than handling firearms, something inside her snapped. The daughter of a deceased Army sharpshooter, she had been raised to never back down from a challenge, and today was no exception. Blake stood frozen, his own rifle still raised halfway to his shoulder, the shot he had been preparing completely forgotten. Around them, the townspeople erupted into excited chatter, money exchanging hands as bets were settled. Old Pete Morrison slapped his knee and laughed so hard his hat nearly fell off, while the saloon girls from the Lucky Dollar leaned over their balcony railing, fanning themselves and giggling at the unexpected turn of events. "Well, I will be," Blake finally said, lowering his weapon completely. He walked toward Harrison with measured steps, his boots kicking up small clouds of red dust. His sun-bronzed face bore an expression she could not quite read, somewhere between impressed and utterly bewildered. He was tall, probably 6 feet 2 inches, with sandy brown hair that curled slightly at the edges beneath his worn Stetson. A few days' worth of stubble covered his strong jaw, and his broad shoulders filled out his dusty work shirt in a way that made Harrison's heart do an unwelcome little flutter. "You planning to say something, or just stand there looking confused?" Harrison asked, trying to keep her voice steady despite the adrenaline still coursing through her veins. She was acutely aware that her honey blonde hair had come loose from its pins during her quick draw, now falling in waves past her shoulders. Her simple blue cotton dress, practical and well-worn, was probably covered in dust from the road, but she refused to show any self-consciousness. Blake stopped a few feet away from her, his eyes studying her face with an intensity that made her breath catch. Then, completely unexpectedly, his lips curved into a genuine smile that transformed his entire face from merely handsome to absolutely devastating. "Marry me before someone else does." The crowd gasped collectively. Harrison felt her jaw drop open, certain she had misheard him. "What did you just say?" "You heard me right, Miss Dalton." Blake took another step closer, his voice carrying clearly across the now deathly silent street. "Any woman who can shoot like that, who has that much fire in her spirit, who can put an arrogant fool like me in his place without batting an eye, well, that is exactly the kind of woman I want by my side for the rest of my life." Harrison stared at him, her mind reeling. This man, this insufferable cowboy who had been nothing but cocky and dismissive of her abilities not 10 minutes ago, was proposing marriage in front of the entire town. It was absurd. It was ridiculous. It was the most presumptuous thing she had ever heard. And yet, there was something in his eyes, a raw honesty and vulnerability that caught her completely off guard. "You are out of your mind," she managed to say, though her voice came out softer than she intended. "You do not even know me. Then let me know you." Blake removed his hat, holding it against his chest in a gesture that seemed almost reverent. "Give me a chance to prove I am not just some fool making wild declarations. I have never met anyone like you, Harrison Dalton, and I suspect I never will again." Before Harrison could respond, her Aunt Mabel pushed through the crowd, her round face flushed with indignation, and something that might have been poorly concealed amusement. "Blake Whitmore, you cannot just propose to my niece in the middle of Main Street like some wild romantic from a dime novel. What would your father say?" "My father would say I am a grown man of 24 years who can make his own decisions," Blake replied, though he had the grace to look slightly sheepish. "But you are right, Miss Mabel. This probably was not the most proper way to go about things." He turned back to Harrison, and the sincerity in his expression made her chest tighten. "I apologize for my boldness, Miss Dalton, but I meant every word. Would you at least allow me to call on you properly, to court you the right way?" Harrison opened her mouth, then closed it again. Part of her wanted to tell him exactly where he could take his sudden proposal and his courtship, but another part, a part she had not even known existed until this moment, was curious. This man had gone from condescending to completely smitten in the span of a single gunshot, and despite her better judgment, she wanted to understand why. "One chance," she heard herself saying, shocked at her own words. "You get one chance to prove you are serious about this and not just embarrassed that a woman outshot you." Blake's face lit up like the sun breaking through storm clouds. "That is all I ask. Thank you, Miss Dalton. You will not regret it." "I am already regretting it," Harrison muttered, but she could not quite suppress the small smile tugging at her lips. Around them, the crowd burst into fresh chatter, this bit of excitement surely destined to be the talk of Red River for weeks to come. As the gathering began to disperse, people returning to their daily business with plenty to gossip about, Harrison felt her aunt's hand on her elbow, steering her away from Blake and toward their small boarding house at the edge of town. "Harrison, Rebecca Dalton, what were you thinking?" Mabel hissed once they were out of earshot, though her eyes were twinkling. "I honestly have no idea," Harrison admitted. "Aunt Mabel, did that really just happen? Did Blake Whitmore actually propose to me?" "He certainly did, dear, in front of God and everyone." Mabel shook her head, but she was smiling. "Though I suppose stranger things have happened. The Whitmore boy has a good reputation, despite his occasional bout of foolishness. Works hard on his father's ranch, honest in his dealings, respectful to his elders. He just has a tendency to speak before thinking, which you witnessed today." Harrison glanced back over her shoulder to see Blake still standing where she had left him, watching her retreat with an expression of wonder on his face. When he caught her looking, he waved and she quickly turned away, her cheeks burning. "He barely knows me. How can he possibly want to marry me based on one shooting demonstration?" "Sometimes people just know," Mabel said softly, a distant look in her eyes. "Your Uncle Henry, God rest his soul, proposed to me after knowing me for only 3 days. Everyone said we were crazy, but we had 37 wonderful years together before the fever took him. Sometimes the heart recognizes its match before the mind catches up." They walked the rest of the way home in contemplative silence, the afternoon heat making the air shimmer above the red earth. Red River was a small town, population barely 400, situated in the northeastern corner of the New Mexico Territory. It had grown up around the cattle trade, with several large ranches in the surrounding area, providing most of the employment and commerce. Harrison had only been living here for 6 months, having come to stay with her aunt after her father's death in a hunting accident back in Kansas. Her father, Michael Dalton, had been one of the finest marksmen in the Union Army during the war, and he had passed his skills and his love of shooting to his only daughter. Her mother had died giving birth to her 20 years ago, so it had always been just Harrison and her father against the world. He had raised her unconventionally, teaching her to shoot, to track, to survive in the wilderness, treating her more like the son he never had than the delicate flower society expected her to be. When he died, she had been lost, adrift in a world that suddenly seemed too large and too empty. Aunt Mabel, her father's sister, had invited her to New Mexico, promising fresh air, wide open spaces, and a chance to start over. Harrison had accepted, bringing little with her except her father's rifles, her mother's wedding ring, and a heart still raw with grief. She had not expected to find anything in Red River except perhaps some peace and quiet. She certainly had not expected to meet someone like Blake Whitmore, and she definitely had not expected him to propose marriage within 10 minutes of their first real interaction. The whole situation was utterly absurd, and yet she could not stop thinking about the way his eyes had softened when he looked at her, the way his voice had steadied with absolute certainty when he said those 4 impossible words. "Aunt Mabel," she said as they climbed the steps to their little house, painted white with blue trim and surrounded by struggling flowers fighting against the harsh climate. What if he was just caught up in the moment? What if by tomorrow he realizes what a ridiculous thing he did and wants nothing more to do with me? Mabel paused at the door, her hand on the knob, and gave Harrison a knowing look. "And would that bother you, dear, if he changed his mind?" Harrison considered the question honestly. "I think it would," she admitted quietly, "which is completely irrational since I have barely spoken to the man." "The heart is rarely rational," Mabel said, pushing open the door and ushering Harrison inside. "Now, let us have some lemonade and discuss how we are going to prepare for Blake Whitmore's courtship. Because mark my words, that young man will be on our doorstep tomorrow at the earliest possible respectable hour." Mabel was right. The next morning, shortly after breakfast, a knock sounded at the door. Harrison, who had been pretending to read the same page of her novel for the past 20 minutes while actually staring out the window, nearly jumped out of her chair. Aunt Mabel gave her an "I told you so" look and went to answer it. Blake stood on the porch, looking freshly scrubbed and nervous. He had shaved, tamed his hair somewhat, and wore clean trousers and a pressed shirt that Harrison suspected he had borrowed from someone since it looked slightly too tight across his shoulders. In his hands, he held a bouquet of wildflowers, clearly picked from the fields surrounding town, their purple and yellow blooms bright against the weathered wood of the porch. "Good morning, Miss Mabel," he said, his voice respectful. "I hope I am not calling too early. I wanted to ask properly if I might court your niece, with your permission and blessing." Mabel looked him up and down, making him wait just long enough to squirm. "My niece is her own woman, Blake Whitmore, and makes her own decisions. But since you asked, you have my permission to try to win her heart, provided you treat her with the respect she deserves." "I would never do otherwise, madam," Blake said earnestly. "See that you do not. Harrison, dear, you have a gentleman caller." Harrison rose from her chair, smoothing her skirts unnecessarily. She had changed her dress 3 times that morning before settling on a simple green cotton that brought out the hazel in her eyes. Now she wondered if she should have chosen something else, or perhaps not tried so hard. But when Blake's face lit up at the sight of her, all her doubts momentarily evaporated. "Miss Dalton," he said, offering her the flowers with an endearingly awkward bow. "These are for you. I know they are not fancy hothouse roses or anything, but I thought you might appreciate something that grows wild and free in this country." Harrison took the bouquet, genuinely touched by the gesture and his reasoning. "They are perfect. Thank you, Mr. Whitmore." "Blake," he corrected gently. "Please call me Blake. Then you must call me Harrison." "Harrison," he repeated, and the way he said her name, soft and careful like something precious, made her stomach flutter. "I was wondering if you might accompany me on a walk this morning. I thought I could show you some of the country around here if you have not already explored it. With your aunt as chaperone, of course," he added quickly, glancing at Mabel. "Oh, I think you two can manage a walk unchaperoned," Mabel said airily. "Red River is small enough that everyone will see you anyway, and Harrison can shoot better than most men if you prove to have dishonorable intentions, which I trust you do not." "No, madam, nothing but honorable intentions." Blake's ears had turned slightly red, which Harrison found oddly charming. They set out together, walking down the dusty main street and then following a path that led toward the red bluffs in the distance. The morning was already warm, promising another scorching afternoon, but for now the air was almost pleasant. Blake maintained a respectful distance beside her, not trying to take her arm or crowd her space, which she appreciated. For a few minutes they walked in silence. Then Blake said, "I owe you an apology for yesterday. Not for the proposal because I meant that, but for what I said before. About women in kitchens. My mother would have boxed my ears for saying something so stupid." "Why did you say it then?" Harrison asked. Blake sighed, removing his hat and running a hand through his hair. "Honestly, because I was showing off for the boys, trying to seem tough and confident. A few of the ranch hands had been ribbing me about not having a woman, saying maybe I was not man enough to attract one, and I let it get under my skin. Then, when you walked up with that rifle, looking so capable and sure of yourself, I felt threatened. Which I know makes me sound like a complete fool." "At least you are an honest fool," Harrison said, surprised by his candor. Most men she knew would never admit to feeling threatened by a woman. "I am trying to be," Blake said. "Look, Harrison, I know yesterday was wild and impulsive, and I know you probably think I am insane for proposing after seeing you shoot one time. But here is the truth. I have been in Red River my whole life. I have known every eligible woman in this town and the surrounding ranches since we were all children. None of them ever made me feel anything beyond friendly affection. Then yesterday, I saw you standing there, fierce and confident and absolutely fearless, and it was like being struck by lightning. Suddenly, I could see my whole future, and you were in it." Harrison stopped walking, turning to face him fully. "That is a lot of pressure to put on someone you barely know. What if I am not the person you think I am? What if you have built up some fantasy in your mind that has nothing to do with reality?" "Then I will fall in love with reality instead," Blake said simply. "I am not asking you to marry me tomorrow, Harrison. I know I said those words yesterday, and I meant them, but I understand you need time. I am asking you to give me a chance to know you, the real you. Let me court you properly. Let me learn what makes you laugh and what makes you sad. Let me prove that what I feel is not just some passing fancy." Harrison studied his face, searching for any sign of insincerity or manipulation. But all she saw was earnest hope and a vulnerability that took courage to show. Against her better judgment, she found herself wanting to trust him, wanting to believe that maybe, just maybe, this sudden connection was not as crazy as it seemed. "All right," she said finally, "but I have conditions." "Name them." "First, no more public declarations or dramatic gestures. If we do this, we do it at a normal pace, like normal people courting." "Agreed." "Second, I am not going to pretend to be someone I am not. I like shooting, I like riding. I am not particularly domestic, and I have no interest in spending my days sewing and gossiping. I would never ask you to change who you are. Honestly, the fact that you can shoot better than me is one of the most attractive things about you." Harrison could not help but smile at that. "Third, if at any point either of us realizes this is not working, we agree to be honest about it and part ways amicably. No hard feelings, no drama." Blake extended his hand. "You have my word." They shook on it, his hand warm and calloused against hers, and Harrison felt that flutter in her stomach again. This was either going to be the best decision she ever made or the worst, and right now she had no idea which, Over the following weeks, Blake proved to be surprisingly good at courting. He showed up regularly but not obsessively, always respectful of Harrison's time and independence. He brought her small gifts, interesting rocks he found while working on the ranch, a book of poetry he thought she might like, a new cleaning kit for her rifles. They took long walks together, sometimes talking nonstop, sometimes enjoying comfortable silence. Harrison learned that Blake had dreams beyond working on his father's ranch. He wanted to start his own spread someday, somewhere with good water and grass, where he could raise horses instead of cattle. He had a gift with animals, a patience and gentleness that seemed at odds with his rugged cowboy exterior. He could spend hours working with a skittish horse, never losing his temper, never forcing the issue. "Most people think you have to break a horse's spirit to ride it," he told her one afternoon as they sat on a fence watching him work with a young mare. "But that is not true. You just have to earn their trust, show them you are not going to hurt them. Once they trust you, they will do anything for you." Harrison wondered if he was talking about more than just horses, but decided not to ask. Instead, she shared stories of her own childhood, of following her father through the Kansas wilderness, of learning to track deer and shoot moving targets. She told him about the lonely years after the war ended, when her father struggled to find his place in a world at peace, how sometimes she would find him staring at nothing, lost in memories she could not reach. "He never recovered from the war," she said quietly. "Not really. He taught me everything he knew, loved me the best way he could, but part of him was always somewhere else, back on some battlefield I could never see." Blake reached over and took her hand, squeezing gently. "I am sorry you lost him, but he gave you an incredible gift, Harrison. He taught you to be strong and capable and fearless. Not every father would do that for a daughter." "I know," she whispered. "I just wish I could have saved him." "What happened?" "Hunting accident. At least, that is what they said. He was out alone, tracking an elk, and his rifle misfired. They found him 2 days later." She paused, swallowing hard. "But my father was meticulous about his weapons. He would never let a rifle misfire. Sometimes I wonder if it really was an accident or if he just got tired of fighting his demons alone." Blake pulled her close, letting her rest her head on his shoulder. They sat like that for a long time, watching the sun paint the sky in shades of orange and pink, and Harrison realized she had never told anyone else that particular fear. There was something about Blake that made her feel safe enough to be vulnerable, which was both terrifying and wonderful. As summer faded into early fall, their relationship deepened. Blake introduced her to his family. His father, Bernard, a gruff but kind rancher who had built the Whitmore spread from nothing. His mother, Catherine, who had died when Blake was 15. And his younger sister, Sarah, a spirited 17-year-old who took to Harrison immediately. "Finally, someone who can shoot worth a damn," Sarah said upon meeting Harrison, earning a reproachful look from her father. "Sorry, Papa, but it is true. Blake has been trying to teach me, but he is terrible at explaining things." "I am not terrible, you just do not listen," Blake protested. "Would you like me to give you some pointers?" Harrison offered, and Sarah's face lit up. They spent a glorious afternoon at the shooting range Bernard had set up on the ranch property, Harrison patiently correcting Sarah's stance and breathing. By the end, Sarah was hitting targets she had been missing all summer, and she threw her arms around Harrison in pure joy. "You have to marry my brother," Sarah declared. "I have decided. We need you in this family." Harrison laughed, but her eyes met Blake's across the range, and the intensity of his gaze made her breath catch. He had not mentioned marriage again since that first day, true to his word about dramatic gestures, but she could see the question in his eyes every time he looked at her. And increasingly, she found herself wanting to say yes. One evening in late September, Blake took her to a spot he claimed was his favorite place in all of New Mexico. They rode on horseback for nearly an hour, climbing into the foothills until they reached a plateau overlooking the valley. From here, they could see Red River laid out like a child's toy town, the river itself winding through the landscape like a ribbon, the vast expanse of sky above seeming to go on forever. "I come here when I need to think," Blake said as they dismounted. "When the ranch feels too small or my father and I butt heads, or when I just need to remember how big the world is." "It is beautiful," Harrison breathed, turning in a slow circle to take it all in. "You are beautiful," Blake said softly, and when she turned to look at him, he was watching her with such open adoration that it made her heart ache. "Harrison, these past 2 months have been the happiest of my life. Every day I wake up thinking about you, and every night I go to sleep grateful that you gave me a chance." "Blake," she started, but he shook his head. "Let me finish. I know I promised no more dramatic declarations, but I need you to know how I feel. I love you, Harrison Dalton. I love your strength and your independence, and the way you never back down from a challenge. I love that you can outshoot every man in the territory, and that you are not afraid to show it. I love how you care for my sister and humor my father and remember little things I tell you. I love every single thing about you, and I will spend the rest of my life proving it if you will let me." Harrison felt tears pricking at her eyes, which was absurd because she never cried. But here she was, standing on a mountaintop with this impossible man, crying like some sentimental fool. "I love you too," she whispered. "I did not want to. I thought it was too fast, too crazy, but I cannot help it. I love you, Blake Whitmore." He closed the distance between them in 2 strides, cupping her face gently in his hands. "Can I kiss you?" "You had better," she said, and then his lips were on hers, warm and soft and perfect. The kiss started gentle but quickly deepened, months of restrained longing pouring out between them. Harrison wrapped her arms around his neck, pressing closer, and Blake made a sound low in his throat that sent shivers down her spine. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Blake rested his forehead against hers. "Marry me," he said. "I know I already asked, and I know I said I would not pressure you, but Harrison, I cannot imagine spending my life with anyone else. Marry me, and I promise I will spend every day trying to deserve you." This time, Harrison did not hesitate. "Yes," she said, laughing through her tears. "Yes, I will marry you." Blake let out a whoop of joy that probably echoed across the entire valley, then picked her up and spun her around until they were both dizzy and laughing. They collapsed onto the grass, lying side by side and looking up at the first stars beginning to appear in the darkening sky. "When?" Blake asked, lacing his fingers through hers. "Soon," Harrison said. "I do not want a long engagement. Is that foolish?" "If it is, then we will be foolish together." He rolled onto his side, propping himself up on one elbow to look down at her. "How about October? That gives us a few weeks to plan, for you to get a dress if you want one, for me to prepare a home for us." "A home?" "My father is giving us the old foreman's house on the east section of the property. It needs work, but it is solid and it has good land around it. We could start our own herd there, begin building toward that horse ranch I told you about, if that is what you want." Harrison thought about it, imagining a life here in this wild, beautiful country, working side by side with this man she loved, building something together. "That is exactly what I want." They rode back to town as the moon rose, both of them grinning like idiots. When Blake dropped her off at Aunt Mabel's house, he kissed her one more time, soft and sweet, a promise of more to come. "I will see you tomorrow, my future wife," he murmured against her lips. "Tomorrow, my future husband." she replied, and watched from the porch as he rode away, her heart so full she thought it might burst. The next few weeks passed in a blur of activity. Aunt Mabel took charge of the wedding preparations with the efficiency of a military general, enlisting half the women in Red River to help. Harrison tried to care about things like flowers and decorations, but mostly she just wanted to be married already, to start their life together. She did allow herself to be fitted for a proper wedding dress, a simple but elegant ivory gown with lace at the collar and cuffs. When she saw herself in the mirror at the dressmaker's shop, she barely recognized the woman staring back at her. She looked happy, she realized. Truly, genuinely happy in a way she had not been since before her father died. Blake, meanwhile, threw himself into fixing up their new home with the help of his father and several ranch hands. Harrison visited one afternoon and found the place transformed. The roof had been repaired, the walls freshly whitewashed, new windows installed to let in light. Blake had built her a gun cabinet for her rifles, installed a larger stove for cooking, and carved their initials into the porch railing. "What do you think?" he asked nervously as she walked through the rooms. "I think it is perfect," she said honestly. "I think I could be very happy here." "We will be happy here," Blake corrected, pulling her into his arms. "I am going to make sure of it." The wedding took place on a crisp October morning, the kind of day where the sky was so blue it almost hurt to look at, and the air smelled of sage and pine. They were married in the small church at the center of Red River, with what seemed like the entire town in attendance. Sarah served as Harrison's maid of honor, barely able to contain her excitement, while Blake's best friend Marcus stood up as his best man. Harrison walked down the aisle on Aunt Mabel's arm, her eyes locked on Blake waiting at the altar. He looked devastatingly handsome in his Sunday best, his hair carefully combed, his eyes shining with emotion. When she reached him and Mabel placed her hand in his, Harrison felt a rightness settle over her, a sense of coming home. The ceremony itself passed in a haze. Harrison was aware of saying her vows, her voice steady and sure, and of Blake's voice, thick with emotion as he promised to love and cherish her all his days. She was aware of the cool metal of the ring he slid onto her finger, a simple gold band that had belonged to his mother. And then the preacher was pronouncing them husband and wife, and Blake was kissing her, and the church erupted in cheers and applause. The celebration afterward was held at the Whitmore Ranch, tables laden with food that the townswomen had prepared, a fiddle player providing music for dancing. Harrison found herself passed from partner to partner, dancing with Blake's father, with Marcus, with old Pete Morrison, who had watched their shooting contest all those weeks ago. "I knew it when I saw you two that day," Pete said, wheezing slightly as they turned. "I said to my wife, I said, those two are going to end up married, mark my words." "Did you really?" Harrison asked, amused. "Well, no, but I should have. It was obvious to anyone with eyes." When Harrison finally made it back to Blake, he pulled her close and they swayed together, barely moving, just holding each other. "Hello, Mrs. Whitmore," he murmured into her hair. "Hello, Mr. Whitmore," she replied, loving the sound of her new name. "Ready to start our life together." "I have been ready since that day you proposed in front of the whole town." Blake laughed, the sound rich and warm. "Best impulsive decision I ever made." As the sun began to set, painting the sky in brilliant shades of orange and red, Blake and Harrison slipped away from the party. They rode to their new home, Blake lifting her off her horse and carrying her across the threshold despite her laughing protests that she was perfectly capable of walking. Inside, he set her down gently, his hands lingering at her waist. "I love you, Harrison Whitmore." "I love you too, Blake Whitmore." That night, they came together as husband and wife, their lovemaking tender and passionate by turns, discovering each other with wonder and delight. Afterward, they lay tangled together in their marriage bed, the moonlight streaming through the window, and talked about their dreams for the future. "I want to build something lasting," Blake said, his fingers tracing lazy patterns on her shoulder. "Not just a ranch, but a legacy. Something we can pass down to our children and their children." "Children?" Harrison asked, raising an eyebrow. "Someday if you want them, no rush." He paused. "Do you want children?" Harrison considered the question. Before meeting Blake, she had never really thought about it, had assumed she would live her life alone. But now, imagining a little boy with Blake's green eyes or a little girl with her father's gift for shooting, she found the idea did not frighten her the way it once might have. "Someday," she agreed. "First, let us focus on building that legacy you mentioned." And build it they did. The first year of their marriage was hard work but deeply satisfying. They started small, purchasing a few horses with good bloodlines, carefully breeding them and training the foals. Harrison discovered she had as much gift for working with horses as Blake did, and together they developed a reputation for producing animals that were not only beautiful but intelligent and well-tempered. Word spread, and soon they were getting orders from as far away as Texas and Colorado. Blake handled the business side of things, negotiating prices and managing the books, while Harrison focused on the training and care of the animals. They made a good team, each complementing the other's strengths, communicating with the ease of people who had known each other far longer than a single year. There were challenges, of course. A harsh winter their first year killed two of their best mares and nearly bankrupted them. Harrison fell from a particularly stubborn stallion and broke her wrist, forcing Blake to manage everything alone for 6 weeks. They had arguments, sometimes fierce ones, about money or methods or simply because they were both stubborn people not accustomed to compromising. But they always worked through it, always came back to the fundamental truth that they loved each other and were stronger together than apart. Their second spring together, Harrison realized her monthly courses were late. At first, she dismissed it as stress or perhaps just her body being irregular as it sometimes was. But when another month passed and still nothing, she began to suspect. Aunt Mabel, visiting for tea one afternoon, took one look at her and knew immediately. "How far along?" Mabel asked bluntly. Harrison set down her teacup with shaking hands. "I think about 3 months, maybe." "Have you told Blake?" "Not yet. I wanted to be sure." She looked up at her aunt, fear and excitement warring in her chest. "What if I am not ready? What if I am a terrible mother?" Mabel reached across the table and squeezed her hand. "Your father raised you to be strong and capable, Harrison. You will bring those same qualities to motherhood. And you will not be doing it alone. You have Blake, and you have me, and you have a whole community of people who care about you." That evening, Harrison waited until after dinner when she and Blake were sitting on their porch watching the sunset. She had rehearsed what to say a dozen different ways, but when the moment came, the words tumbled out without grace or eloquence. "I am pregnant." Blake froze, his coffee cup halfway to his lips. For a moment he just stared at her, and Harrison felt her stomach drop, wondering if he was disappointed or upset. Then he set down the cup very carefully, turned to her, and smiled with such pure joy that tears sprang to her eyes. "Really? We are going to have a baby, really?" Blake let out a shout and pulled her into his arms, holding her so tightly she could barely breathe. "We are going to have a baby," he repeated, wonder in his voice. Then he pulled back, looking worried. "Are you all right? Is everything okay? Should you be sitting? Do you need anything?" Harrison laughed, wiping at her eyes. "I am fine, Blake. Women have been having babies since the beginning of time. I am not made of glass. I know, but you are precious to me, you and this baby both." He placed his hand gently on her stomach, which was just beginning to show the slightest curve. I am going to be a father." "You are going to be a wonderful father," Harrison said, covering his hand with hers. The pregnancy was not easy. Harrison was sick constantly during the first few months, unable to keep down anything but dry toast and weak tea. As her belly grew, she found it harder to do the physical work she loved, forced to leave more and more of the horse training to Blake. She hated feeling useless and weak, hated being dependent, but Blake was endlessly patient with her moods and frustrations. "You are growing our child," he reminded her one evening when she was particularly frustrated with her limitations. "That is the hardest work there is, Harrison. Everything else can wait." Their son was born on a hot August day in 1880, almost exactly 2 years after that fateful shooting contest. The labor was long and difficult, lasting nearly 18 hours, and there were moments when Harrison was sure she was going to die. But Aunt Mabel was there, coaching her through each contraction, and Blake held her hand through it all, his face pale but determined. When the baby finally came, red-faced and squalling, and the midwife placed him in Harrison's arms, every moment of pain was instantly forgotten. He was perfect, tiny and wrinkled and absolutely perfect, with a shock of dark hair and his father's green eyes. "He is beautiful," Blake whispered, tears streaming unashamedly down his face. "You are both beautiful. Thank you, Harrison, thank you for this gift." They named him Michael, after Harrison's father, and from the moment he entered the world, he had both his parents completely wrapped around his tiny fingers. Blake proved to be as devoted a father as he was a husband, rising in the night to walk with the baby when he cried, changing diapers without complaint, spending hours just watching his son sleep with an expression of absolute wonder. Harrison discovered depths of love she had not known she possessed. Motherhood terrified her sometimes, the sheer weight of responsibility for this tiny life, but it also filled her with a fierce protectiveness and joy. She might not be the most conventional mother in Red River, returning to work with the horses as soon as she was able and teaching Michael to ride almost before he could walk, but she loved her son with every fiber of her being. As Michael grew from infant to toddler to curious little boy, Blake and Harrison's ranch continued to thrive. By their 5th anniversary, they had expanded significantly, purchasing more land and hiring 2 ranch hands to help with the workload. Their horses were known throughout the territory, and they had established themselves as one of the premier breeding operations in New Mexico. But more than the business success, what mattered most to both of them was the life they had built together. The laughter that filled their home, the quiet moments at the end of long days, the way they could communicate with just a glance after years of partnership. They still argued sometimes, both too stubborn and passionate for perfect harmony, but they had learned how to fight fair and make up afterward, often in their bedroom with the kind of passion that had not diminished despite the years and familiarity. When Michael was 4 years old, Harrison became pregnant again. This time, the pregnancy was easier, perhaps because she knew what to expect. Their daughter arrived in the spring of 1885, a tiny thing with Harrison's honey-blonde hair and a temper to match. "What should we name her?" Blake asked, cradling his daughter while Michael peered at his new sister with suspicious curiosity. "Catherine," Harrison said without hesitation, "after your mother." Blake's eyes grew suspiciously bright. "Are you sure?" "I am sure. Your mother gave me you, which gave me all of this. It seems only right." Little Catherine proved to be even more headstrong than her brother, asserting her opinions loudly from the moment she could talk. As she grew, it became clear she had inherited both her mother's shooting skills and her father's way with horses, along with a stubborn independence that sometimes drove both parents to distraction, but also filled them with pride. The years flowed past. marked by the changing seasons and the rhythms of ranch life. Michael grew into a serious young man who shared his father's business acumen, while Catherine became known as the best shot in the territory by the time she was 15, even better than her mother had been at that age. They added 2 more children to their family, a son named Benjamin in 1888 and another daughter, Elizabeth, in 1890. Their last child born when Harrison was 40. Through it all, Blake and Harrison's love never wavered. If anything, it deepened with time, the passion of their early days mellowing into something even more profound. They knew each other completely now, every scar and secret, every fear and dream. They had weathered droughts and economic downturns, illness and injury, the everyday trials of raising 4 strong-willed children. And they had done it together, partners in every sense of the word. On their 20th anniversary, Blake took Harrison back to the plateau, where he had first told her he loved her. Their children were old enough now to manage things for an evening. Michael 20 years old and more than capable. Catherine 15 and possibly more competent than either of her parents when it came to the horses. The view was exactly as Harrison remembered, the valley spreading out below them, the sky vast and endless above. But everything else was different. They were different, no longer the young couple uncertain of the future, but 2 people who had built a life and a family and a legacy together. "Do you remember the first time I brought you here?" Blake asked, his arm around her waist. "I remember," Harrison said, leaning into his warmth. "I thought you were crazy, moving so fast. I was crazy, crazy in love with you. Still." Blake turned her to face him, his hands framing her face exactly as he had done all those years ago. His hair was shot through with gray now, lines etched around his eyes from years of squinting into the sun, but to Harrison he was as handsome as ever. "More than ever," he said seriously. "Harrison, you have given me everything I ever dreamed of, and things I never knew I wanted. You have been my partner, my lover, my best friend. You have given me 4 incredible children and helped me build something that will last long after we are gone. Every day I wake up grateful that you took a chance on some fool cowboy who proposed after knowing you for all of 10 minutes. Harrison laughed, though her eyes were wet with tears. "I am pretty grateful I took that chance too. Though I will say, Blake Whitmore, you are significantly less of a fool than you used to be. Only because you taught me how to be a better man." They kissed as the sun set, the same passion still there despite 2 decades of marriage, tempered now with tenderness and deep knowledge of each other. When they finally pulled apart, Harrison rested her head on Blake's chest, listening to the steady beat of his heart. "I love you," she said simply. "Thank you for being too stubborn to give up on us. Thank you for being brave enough to give me a chance." They stood there until the stars came out, holding each other under the vast New Mexico sky. 2 souls who had found each other against all odds and built a love that would endure for the rest of their days. The years that followed were marked by both joy and sorrow, as all lives are. Blake's father, Bernard, passed away peacefully in his sleep in 1892, leaving the main Whitmore ranch to Blake and Harrison since Sarah had married a lawyer and moved to Santa Fe. They merged the 2 properties, creating one of the largest and most successful horse ranches in the territory. Harrison's Aunt Mabel lived to the remarkable age of 86, sharp-witted until the end, passing away in 1896, surrounded by the family she had helped create. Harrison grieved her deeply, knowing that without Mabel's support and wisdom in those early days, she might never have given Blake a chance. Their children grew and made their own paths. Michael married a schoolteacher from Taos and took over managing the business side of the ranch, proving himself even more astute than his father. Catherine, true to her independent nature, shocked everyone by becoming a sharpshooter in a traveling Wild West show for a few years, before settling down with a rancher from Colorado and starting her own breeding operation. Benjamin chose a different path entirely, studying law and eventually becoming a judge. Though he always maintained, he learned his sense of justice from watching his parents treat everyone with fairness and respect. Elizabeth, their youngest, inherited her mother's wanderlust and her father's way with animals, traveling throughout the West as a horse trainer before returning home to help run the family ranch. Through it all, Blake and Harrison remained the center of their ever-expanding family, the foundation upon which everything else was built. They became grandparents many times over, their house always full of visiting children and grandchildren, the sound of laughter echoing through rooms that had once been so quiet. On a cool October morning in 1910, Harrison and Blake sat together on the porch of their home, now expanded and improved over the years, but still fundamentally the same place where they had started their married life. Blake was 76 now, still strong but moving slower, his hair completely white. Harrison at 60 was still capable of outworking people half her age, though she had finally consented to let their children and grandchildren take on most of the daily operations. "Do you remember the shooting contest?" Blake asked suddenly, a common question between them over the years, the story having become family legend. "Of course I remember," Harrison said, taking his hand. "Best day of my life, even if I did not know it at the time. Mine too. Though I believe our wedding day might edge it out slightly." "Only slightly," Blake grinned, the same charming smile that had won her heart all those years ago. "Well, you did look particularly beautiful that day you shot me down in front of the whole town." Harrison laughed, the sound carrying across their land, past the corrals where horses grazed peacefully, past the house where Michael and his wife were raising their children, across fields they had worked together for more than 40 years. "I love you, Blake Whitmore," she said, as she had said thousands of times before and would say thousands more. "I love you too, Harrison Whitmore," he replied, bringing her hand to his lips and kissing it gently. "Thank you for saying yes. Thank you for being crazy enough to ask." They sat together in comfortable silence, watching the sun climb higher in the sky. Two people who had found each other in the most unlikely way and built a love story for the ages. The wild young cowboy who had proposed after 10 minutes and the fierce woman who had taken a chance on him were still there, underneath the gray hair and weathered skin. Their love as strong and true as it had been that very first day. Behind them, the sounds of their family filled the air. Grandchildren playing, their own children discussing ranch business, the everyday noise of a life well lived and full of love. And in front of them stretched the land they had tamed together, the legacy they had built, proof that sometimes the craziest chances lead to the most beautiful destinations. As the morning wore on, and family members began to gather for the Sunday dinner that had become tradition, Harrison looked around at the faces of children and grandchildren, at the ranch that bore their name and their values, at the man beside her who had been her partner in all things for more than 40 years. She thought about that hot August day in 1878 when she had picked up a rifle and changed her life forever, when a cocky cowboy had seen her shoot and somehow known she was the one. It had been wild and impulsive and completely illogical, and it had been absolutely perfect. Blake squeezed her hand, and when she looked at him, she saw her own contentment reflected in his eyes. They had built this together, brick by brick, day by day, through hard work and dedication, and a love that had never faltered. They had started with nothing but a chance and a promise, and they had created something that would endure long after they were gone. Their oldest grandson approached, a boy of 12 with Blake's green eyes and Harrison's steady hands. "Grandma, will you teach me to shoot today? Papa said you are still the best in the whole territory." Harrison looked at Blake, who nodded his encouragement. "Of course I will," she said, standing and ruffling the boy's hair. "Let me tell you a story first, though, about the day I outshot your grandfather in front of the whole town. And the day I was smart enough to propose immediately," Blake added, coming to stand beside her. Their grandson looked between them, clearly delighted by this oft-told tale. "Because you said someone else would marry her if you did not." "Exactly right," Blake confirmed, pulling Harrison close. "Best decision I ever made." As they walked toward the shooting range, 3 generations of Whitmores heading out together, Harrison felt a deep sense of peace settle over her. This was what mattered: family, love, legacy. This was what that impulsive proposal had led to, what taking a chance on love had created. The afternoon sun beat down warm on their shoulders as Harrison began setting up targets, her movements still sure and practiced despite her years. Blake stood nearby, offering commentary and encouragement while their grandson watched with eager attention. Around them, the ranch bustled with life and activity, the result of decades of hard work and partnership. And when Harrison raised her rifle and fired, hitting the center target with the same precision she had shown all those years ago in the middle of Main Street, Blake's whoop of pride and joy echoed across the valley they had made their own. Some things, Harrison thought with a smile, never changed. Blake would always be her biggest supporter, her fiercest advocate, the man who had seen her fire and fallen in love instantly. And she would always be the woman who had taken a chance on an impulsive cowboy's proposal, who had chosen love over caution, who had built a beautiful life from a single moment of wild possibility. As the sun began to set on another day in Red River, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson, the Whitmore family gathered together for dinner. The table was long and crowded, filled with children and grandchildren, with laughter and conversation, and the comfortable chaos of a large family who genuinely loved being together. Blake sat at one end, Harrison at the other, their eyes meeting frequently across the crowded table, a lifetime of love and understanding passing between them in those glances. This was their legacy, not just the successful ranch or the renowned horses, but this. A family built on love and respect, children who had grown into good people, grandchildren who would carry their values into the future. After dinner, as the younger children were tucked into bed and the older ones settled into conversation around the fireplace, Blake and Harrison slipped outside one more time. It had become their ritual, these quiet moments at the end of the day when they could just be together, the way they had been from the very beginning. "No regrets?" Blake asked, as he sometimes did, though he surely knew the answer by now. "Not a single one," Harrison replied, as she always did. "You? Only that I did not find you sooner." Harrison leaned against him, his arm coming around her shoulders automatically, perfectly fitted to her shape after all these years. Above them, stars were beginning to appear, the same stars that had witnessed their first kiss on that plateau, the same sky that had arched over their wedding day, the same heavens that had watched over every moment of their life together. "Blake, yes, my love. I would do it all again, exactly the same. Every moment, every challenge, every joy, all of it." Blake pressed a kiss to the top of her head. "So would I, though maybe I would have been a little less cocky at that shooting contest." "Do not you dare," Harrison said firmly. "If you had been anyone other than exactly who you were, I might not have wanted to put you in your place. And then where would we be?" "Fair point," Blake conceded with a laugh. They stood there in the gathering darkness, two people who had started as strangers and become everything to each other. The wild young woman with a rifle and the impulsive cowboy with a dream had built something more lasting than either could have imagined, something that would echo through generations, yet unborn. Inside the house, their family carried on, the legacy of their love made flesh and bone and beating hearts. Outside, under the vast New Mexico sky, Blake and Harrison held each other close and counted their blessings, knowing that they had been given something rare and precious. A love that had started with a single perfect shot and a wild proposal, and had grown into a lifetime of partnership, passion, and unshakable devotion. As they finally turned to go inside, back to the warmth and noise and beautiful chaos of their family, Harrison paused one more time, looking out over the land they had built together. Somewhere out there was the spot where she had first outshot Blake, where everything had begun. And here, 42 years later, they were still standing, still together, still so deeply in love that it took her breath away. "Thank you," she whispered to the night, to fate, to whatever force had brought them together that August day. Blake heard her and understood, as he always did. "Thank you," he echoed, and they walked inside together, hand in hand, ready for whatever the future might bring, secure in the knowledge that they would face it the way they had faced everything, together. The years continued to flow past like the river the town was named for, carrying Blake and Harrison gently toward the twilight of their lives. They grew older together with the same grace they had brought to everything else, aging not as two people growing apart, but as two trees whose roots had become so intertwined they were essentially one. In 1918, when the Great War finally ended and their grandson Jonathan returned home safely, Blake and Harrison stood with their family to welcome him, grateful beyond words that their bloodline would continue unmarred by that distant tragedy. They were well into their 80s now, both moving slower but still sharp, still engaged with the ranch and the family and each other. Blake's health began to fail in the winter of 1920. Nothing dramatic, just a gradual slowing, a growing weakness that he tried to hide from Harrison, but which she saw with the clarity of someone who had been watching him for more than 4 decades. She said nothing, respecting his dignity, but she stayed closer, her hand finding his more frequently, her presence a constant comfort. On a clear spring morning in April 1921, Blake woke early, as was his habit. Harrison stirred beside him, and he took a moment just to look at her, this woman who had been his everything for 43 years of marriage. Her hair was white now, her face lined with the marks of a life well lived, but to him she was still the fierce young woman who had outshot him and stolen his heart. "Good morning, my love," he whispered. Harrison opened her eyes, and her smile was as warm as it had been that very first time. "Good morning. How are you feeling?" "Like the luckiest man who ever lived," Blake said truthfully. They rose together and went through their morning routine, a dance perfected over decades. Breakfast with whichever family members were staying at the main house, a walk around the property to check on things, though their children really ran everything now. Coffee on the porch while they watched the sun climb higher. "You ever think about that day?" Blake asked. "The shooting contest." Harrison laughed softly. "Blake Whitmore, you ask me that at least once a week. Yes, I think about it. I think about how one moment changed everything. How one decision to accept your ridiculous courtship gave me this entire beautiful life. I was not that ridiculous. You proposed after watching me shoot one time. Best decision I ever made," Blake said, taking her hand. His grip was weaker than it used to be, but his love was as strong as ever. "Harrison, I need you to know something." The seriousness in his tone made her turn to look at him fully. "What is it?" I need you to know that every single day with you has been a gift, that you made me better than I ever could have been alone, that our children and grandchildren and this entire life we built is the greatest achievement I could ever claim, and it is all because of you. Blake, why are you talking like this? Harrison felt a flutter of fear in her chest. Because I love you and I want to make sure you know it. That is all. They sat together in the morning sunshine, hands clasped, two hearts beating as one as they had for more than 40 years. And when Blake's grip gradually loosened, and his breathing slowed and finally stopped, Harrison held him close, tears streaming down her face but also a strange sense of peace. He had died as he had lived, with her beside him, in the home they had built, surrounded by the evidence of a life filled with love. The funeral was attended by what seemed like half of New Mexico. Blake Whitmore had been well loved and respected, a pillar of the community, a devoted family man, a true partner to his wife in all things. But the person who grieved him most was Harrison, who had lost her best friend, her lover, her partner, her everything. In the days and weeks that followed, Harrison moved through her grief with the same strength and determination she had brought to everything else in her life. She missed Blake with an ache that never fully subsided, but she found comfort in their children and grandchildren, in the ranch they had built, in the memories of 43 years of marriage that had been, by any measure, extraordinarily happy. She lived another 7 years, active and engaged until the very end, teaching great-grandchildren to shoot, sharing stories of the old days, keeping Blake's memory alive through her words and her presence. She watched the ranch continue to thrive under Michael's stewardship, saw Catherine's operation in Colorado become even more successful, took pride in Benjamin's career and Elizabeth's adventures. On a warm August morning in 1928, exactly 50 years after that fateful shooting contest, Harrison woke in the bedroom she had shared with Blake, feeling oddly peaceful. She was 98 years old, had lived a life fuller and richer than she had ever dreamed possible, and she was tired. She had outlived her husband by 7 years, and while she had found joy in that time, she was ready to be with him again. Her family gathered when it became clear the end was near. Her children, now elderly themselves, her grandchildren, some with children of their own, all came to say goodbye to the woman who had been the foundation of their family. Harrison greeted each one, dispensed advice and love in equal measure, and waited calmly for what came next. As the sun set on that August day, painting the sky in the same brilliant colors it had shown 50 years before, Harrison closed her eyes and thought of Blake. She thought of his smile, his laugh, the way he had looked at her like she was the most precious thing in the world. She thought of their life together, every moment from that impulsive proposal to their last morning together, and she smiled. "I am coming, my love," she whispered. "Wait for me just a little longer." And then, peacefully, surrounded by the family she and Blake had created, Harrison Whitmore took her last breath and slipped away, her hand held by her oldest son, her legacy secure in the generations that would follow. They buried her next to Blake on a hill overlooking the ranch, their headstones side by side as they had been in life. The inscription Harrison had chosen for Blake's stone read, "Beloved husband, father, and partner, he saw her fire and loved her for it." On her own, placed by her children, the words read, "Beloved wife, mother, and pioneer, she took a chance on love and built a legacy." The Whitmore Ranch continued for generations, always run by descendants of Blake and Harrison, always maintaining the values they had established: integrity, hard work, respect for all people, and above all, the belief that love was the foundation of everything worthwhile. The story of their meeting became family legend, passed down through the years, embellished slightly with each telling but always maintaining the essential truth. A cocky young cowboy had seen a fierce young woman shoot, had known immediately she was the one, and had been brave enough to say so. In 1978, exactly 100 years after that famous shooting contest, the Whitmore family held a massive reunion at the ranch. Hundreds of descendants gathered, coming from all over the country, all able to trace their lineage back to Blake and Harrison. They held a shooting competition in honor of their matriarch, and the winner, a great-great-granddaughter named Hannah who had inherited Harrison's steady hands and Blake's green eyes, was presented with Harrison's original rifle, lovingly maintained over the decades. As the family gathered that evening, sharing stories and memories and marveling at the legacy two people had created from a single impulsive moment, the eldest member present stood to speak. He was 92 years old, Blake and Harrison's youngest grandchild, one of the last people alive who had actually known them both. "I want to tell you about my grandparents," he said, his voice still strong despite his years. "I was privileged to know them both, to see their love firsthand, and I can tell you that every story you have heard is true. They were partners in the fullest sense of the word, equals who built something extraordinary together. My grandmother was the strongest woman I ever knew, and my grandfather was wise enough to recognize that strength and love her for it, rather than fear it. They taught all of us what real love looks like, not just passion, though they had plenty of that, but partnership, respect, commitment through good times and bad. That is their real legacy, not the ranch or the horses or the money, but the example they set of how to love someone well." The crowd was silent, many wiping away tears, all feeling the weight of that legacy on their shoulders. Then someone raised a glass in toast and the others followed suit. To Blake and Harrison, the toast went up. "May we all be brave enough to take a chance on love." To Blake and Harrison, the crowd echoed, and the words carried out across the ranch, past the corrals and the fields, across the land that two people had claimed and tamed and made into something lasting, up to the stars that had witnessed it all, eternal and unchanging as the love that had started it. And somewhere, in whatever realm exists beyond this one, Blake and Harrison smiled, their hands clasped as always, watching over the family they had created and the legacy they had built from one perfect shot and 4 impossible words. "Marry me before someone else does." The end.